Hello everyone and welcome to the 2nd November Academy session. The theme for November is Magnus Carlsen. So we're getting ready for the World Championship match happening at the end of November where he will compete against Jan. So I want to show you some instructive games from Magnus Carlsen, and the one that I'm going to show you tonight is focused on a match against England's best player. Do you know who that is? Say in the chat if you do. I mean, it's a bit, obviously with lockdown and everything going on, it's a bit controversial as to who England's top player is, but he's won the most amount of competitions. But I think there's a lot of strong players in England. Lots of people saying David Howe. Yeah, David Howe is very, very strong and very on form at the moment. He's just missed out on the candidates just by a fraction, just had a fantastic tournament result. This is against somebody who's a bit older than David. He's played on board one for the England Olympiad team many times, and he's been British champion many times. No, it's not Nigel Short. I'm going to keep you guys guessing and then we'll get going. We've already gone. Yes, well done, Kushal. Michael Adams. He did an academy session earlier in the year, which I'm sure some of you attended. So let's take a look at this game. Let me share my screen. Just do that. Okay, so this was a game played many years ago, Magnus Carlsen against Michael Adams, and it's very, very deep. There's a lot of theory, a lot of calculation that went on in this game, a bit like the one we looked at before. You could study the position for hours and hours and you probably wouldn't know exactly how much Magnus calculated. I just wanted to show you that he just calculates so deep and he really sees a lot of crucial things. So there's two key points in this game, which to me are really, really very instructive. So this is game 4 in your content. So maybe some of you have had a chance to look at this game. I've played through this game many times and I still don't understand the full extent of it. It's that complicated and that deep. So even if you've already seen this game, it's really good to have a look at it again. Okay, so I'm not going to focus on the opening, so we'll just whiz through this. This opening's been played thousands of times. You can let me know if you know what opening it is. Just tell me in the chat. Maybe some of you play this. Oh, Gregory has got it already, the Nimzo Indian. I think it's a very nice, robust opening, but to understand it well, you need to know a lot of ideas because you can get all sorts of positions from the Nimzo Indian. And Magnus is white, by the way, but you can probably see that from the screen. So he played bishop f4, and then Michael Adams played a typical sacrifice by moving the bishop to a6. So just to make sure everyone's awake, why is that a sacrifice? What can white play now? Yeah, well done, Gregory. So the c pawn is attacked twice and only defended once, so white can take on c7. It's not really a good idea for white to avoid taking because otherwise black's just managed to develop a piece with tempo, so it's attacking the queen. So if you just retreat the queen back, which has been played a few times, I had a look at the history of the opening when I was playing through the game, and this has been played a few times, but not by very, very strong players, because once you've allowed your opponent to develop with tempo, you need to really get something for it. So that is the free pawn, or the seemingly free pawn, but black does get compensation. So here, well, actually, does somebody want to tell me what you think the compensation might be? So if white takes, which white did do, what compensation do you think black can get for that pawn? Because at this level of chess, if you just a pawn down, you're sort of 90% sure to lose. So write some answers in the chat. You can write it to everyone. Yeah, Gregory and Anna, quick development. Yeah, does anyone want to be more specific on the development? What's a good asset to black's position? Try not to give it away. Maybe a special type of move that black might be able to do. let some more people into the meeting. Yeah, Anna said 2 moves from connecting the rooks. Yeah, so where would black's rooks like to be, or where would one of them like to be ideally? Yeah, good. So it's really the C file that black wants out of this. So, and as people said, the quick development, because I mean, look at white's pieces, they're not developed. The king's still in the center, and black's developed all of his minor pieces apart from this knight. So even though, yeah, white's won a pawn, which, you know, I like free pawns if they're there. If the game carries on and white ends up developing, then white's just going to be a lot better because he's a pawn up. So black needs to act quickly. If you don't act quickly, white can consolidate by getting all the pieces out, and then white's just going to win the game. So black needs to be prepared to develop fast, and Michael Adams was, but Magnus came up with an ingenious plan. Welcome to people that have just joined the meeting. We're looking at the game Magnus Carlsen versus Michael Adams. So the knight went to f3 now. White's desperately trying to develop. Rook to c8. So black didn't waste time developing his last minor piece. He just moved his rook to the open file. And if black can get the rook to c2 and then potentially win a pawn, he's going to be doing very, very well. I mean, just let me know, do you prefer white or do you prefer black here? It's an interesting question. If you're materialistic and you don't see the compensation, then you probably prefer white because white's just a point ahead. However, if you like sacrificing for play, then you might prefer to be black. Okay, so interesting answers. A couple of people going for black, a couple of people going for white. It's always a risk. Do I sacrifice this pawn because I can get positional compensation, or is it not going to work? And I suppose it's the same when you sacrifice pieces for an attack. If the attack works and you win the game, then it's completely worth it. But if the attack doesn't work, you're just left behind on material. So it's a fine balance. You've got to be very, very precise. And Magnus was extremely precise in this game, which is why I wanted to show it to you. So let's just carry on. Bishop went to f4. Because if white takes the knight now, just to gain a bit of time, after rook a takes, black has clearly got a lot of compensation for the pawn, and he's just going to get his rook to c2 next. So that wouldn't have been a good move. He wants to hold on to the bishop, and he did that by bishop f4. And now knight bd7. This next move was called in the commentary as an absolutely ingenious move. So white to play. I mean, this is in the study material for this month, so you may have already seen this. This is an absolutely fantastic move. And white's got a very clever idea planned when he plays this move. And probably he had this planned when he took the pawn on c7. So don't worry, Aidan, no problem. So this move is actually breaking the opening rules, because you might be thinking, well, white just needs to get this bishop out as soon as possible because it's not developed. And you can achieve that maybe by moving the pawn to g3 or maybe e3. I'm not suggesting they're good moves, but they'd be the first thing on my mind if I had this position with white, because I just want to get that bishop out and then maybe get castled, and then maybe all my problems will go away if I can get my rook to c1, and maybe I'll be a pawn up. So that would be sort of my thinking in this position. But white didn't do that. So white actually, a few people have said this in the chat. Yeah, it's fine to write your chat to everyone so we can just discuss and talk about the game. Yes, knight to d2. But why? Why has he moved the knight to d2? What's his next move? What's his plan? Because I would be really scared in this position that once black gets the rook to c2, I can't get rid of it. So it's just going to be lodged in my position for a long time, and it's going to be on the second rank. Black can bring the other rook in, and my position could go horribly wrong. I'm sure we've all had games like that where you're a pawn up, your opponent gets a piece lodged in your position, suddenly they get the pawn back, and then suddenly another pawn drops, and then maybe a piece, and then the game. I mean, I can really relate to that, and maybe some of you can. Let me know if you can. Has that happened to you? Or maybe you've been on the other side of it. Okay, good. Oh, a few people on the other side of it. Excellent. Nice to hear that. Yeah, so the idea, the really amazing idea is that this knight is going to go to A1 so that it can challenge the rook when it gets to C2. And I think that's a really clever idea. I mean, I wouldn't think, you know, I'm sure the world champion would be able to come up with an idea of that level, but it's very weird to plan to put the knight in the corner. You know, the worst square really for the knight if you were just looking at the board, because it doesn't control much, but it's then going to control the really important square that black wants to get a hold of and, you know, really restrict white's play. Don't worry, Rakaya, we're just looking at a game, Magnus Carlsen versus Michael Adams. Okay, so knight d2, and hopefully you can understand when we see the game why that's so good. Other ideas here, rook to b1 does make sense because it's going to be defending this pawn. And you can put this in the file with your materials. You can put the knight to e1 to attack the rook, and then it was a computer suggestion, this line, but this looks pretty good for white as well. Same idea of just getting rid of that rook as soon as possible. So that's also good. I don't think there are any other good moves in that position. So let's carry on. Knight d2, rook went to c2, and now we need to defend the pawn. So how would you defend the pawn here? Would you move it forward or would you defend it? Just let me know in the chat what you'd play. And again, if you've looked through the material and seen the game before, that's great. And this will just help with your understanding, because this is a really complicated game. I've played through it many times, and there's still really important aspects of it, which are very challenging and very difficult to understand. Okay, great. So most people want to play rook b1, which makes sense. Somebody did suggest b3. Problem with that is, I'm not saying it's a bad move, but it does allow the other rook to come to c8, and then you've created a weakness. Remember, every pawn move creates a weakness. So here, I just feel like it's uncomfortable. What would we play now if we tried to carry on with our plan of knight b3? Oh, wait, our pawn's in the way, so it doesn't work. And now how are we going to get rid of this rook? Maybe we're not. And then maybe black will be able to double rooks on the second rank and mop up our pawns. And I think this is going to be very tricky. I mean, we can try maybe king to d1. But I don't like this position at all. I would much prefer to be black here. Feels very uncomfortable for white, despite white being a pawn up. So rook b1 is right, and it follows with our plan of going rook to b3 and knight to b3 and knight to a1. Yeah, so Gregory just said about rook to b2, and I think you're right. If I was playing black in that line we were looking at, rook b2 looks very good, and then it restricts this knight from moving as well. So yeah, good suggestion. And just checking the chat. Yeah, okay. So after rook b1, black went so rook c8, and now knight to b3. So white wants to play knight a1 to chase away the rook. And it does look really ridiculous, but it's actually hard for black to stop that plan. And I don't know at what point Mickey Adams realized this plan, but it's just very annoying. I mean, you know what your opponent's going to do, and there's no easy way of keeping the activity that black's got, which is black's compensation for the pawn. So bishop c4 happened, now knight a1. And then black came up with bishop a2. Have a look at that position. Has white just gone wrong? What is going on here? That rook looks like it's attacked. If the rook moves, then rook takes b2, and black seems to be doing very well. So what should white play here? Just let me know in the chat. Yeah, so rook d1 doesn't work. Someone just mentioned that in the chat, but yeah, just take here, and black's doing well. So we need to take the rook. It's an only move. We need to take the rook. So we take their rook, they take ours, and I don't know, have we solved the problem of black's activity? White to play. What should we play now? Yes, exactly. The knight comes back to that amazing square of a1, and it looks so silly, but it's just stopping black's main way of getting activity. And yeah, that knight will come back into the game, but we need to allow some time to prevent what black's doing, prophylactic thinking, and then we're doing well, and we can hopefully get out of this a pawn up. I mean, this game was a messy game because white ended up having to give the pawn back. But at this point, I think white's doing very well. So an exclamation mark for knight a1. It's not often you'd put the knight in the corner and it would be a good move. So I think this game is very instructive. So knight to d5 happened. Basically now, Michael Adams needs to create activity, because otherwise white will consolidate and white will just be a pawn up and be able to win the end game. So that's why he's moving all his pieces out, and he's breaking with e5 to get the other knight on d7 into the game and to try and cause white problems. So e3 happened. White's trying to get the bishop into the game. Black's maneuvering with his pieces. That knight wants to come and put pressure maybe on the weak point of e4. So f3, knight c6, bishop c4, rook d8, and now white went king to f2. So white is doing well now. He's managed to get rid of some of black's counterplay, and he's managed to get all his pieces out. Now this rook, the final piece, is going to get into the game, and he's now attacking the black bishop on b1. So bishop f5, knight b3. You can't keep the knight in the corner forever, because otherwise it's not really a piece. You might as well have it off the board. So it's just about getting that knight into the game, and when it goes to b3, it does defend d4. Bishop e6, and now we need to get our final piece into the game. So what should we play? White to play. Some suggestions in the chat of rook e1. That's, I think, a good move. Also, rook c1's a good move, and that's what Magnus decided to play. But I think both of them are good. Moving the rook to an open file is normally the best way of playing with the rooks. So rook to c1 was played, but I don't think rook e1's a bad move at all. I suppose the point of rook c1 is that it's x-ray attacking the knight, and black's got to think about something, whereas on e1 the bishop's already defended. So after f6, white's managed to develop, but things are not easy. So to convert this position is going to be quite challenging, because black's got a very nice light squared blockade going on, and white's pieces are currently lacking scope. They don't feel like they're that well placed. This knight is in a position we hoped it would come into the game and do very well, but at the moment it's looking at squares that are defended by black's pawn, and it's kind of tied down to defending this. I feel like it's kind of blocking out any, hope for that bishop. So it doesn't look so clear for white, even though white has managed to get rid of the main counterplay that black had. I think white's better because white's a pawn up, but white still has to convert this game. And I'm sure you've had games where you're a pawn up and you don't win. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to all of you here. And this is going to be quite tricky. And still tricky even for the world champion. So Magnus has to think about the best way forward. And he decided to go a4. And this basically provoked black to make a bad move. So black moved the pawn to a5, and I've already highlighted it, but this pawn is now a weakness. So that's going to be a target for white later on in the game. I'm just looking at the chat. Yep, that's right, Aidan. So by playing a4, you prevent a5. But now this b6 pawn is just, I think that's a chronic weakness. It's going to stay there for a long time, and it's going to be easy to attack if you take your time. You know, the strong players, they don't rush. They just take their time and they gradually think about the weaknesses and they work out a way to attack them. We saw that in the first Carlsen session where we looked at another game. And here, I think this is just going to cause some problems later on in the game for black, as we'll see. So white's making some maneuvering moves. Here. And this gets to the point where I think this is quite interesting. So white has basically just moved the bishop back to f1, and he's basically giving back the pawn, but he wants to get an advantage with the bishop pair, and that's what he's relying on here. I mean, other players would go for different moves here. I'm a materialistic player, so I'm sure I would have probably gone for maybe swapping the bishops off and protecting the d pawn. Maybe trying to defend it with rook to d1. Anyone in the audience, would you play anything else? Some suggestions? Because, I mean, Magnus's move here is definitely not the top move by the engine, but then he is the world champion, and he was probably confident that he could win that position. It's not about finding the best move according to the engine. It's about finding the best move and plan that you're comfortable winning. And he thought he could outplay his opponent here with bishop f1. Brokaya says, same as Sarah, she's a greedy player. So yeah, bishop takes f7 looks like a good option, Bodhana. I like that as well. And it's interesting to see how people would play these positions. Even I've looked through this game lots, and I don't think if I had this position in my game, I'd be confident playing bishop f1. I think I'd prefer to go with maybe bishop takes f7 or maybe rook d1. Some interesting comments there in the chat. So yeah, bishop f1, but this is a world champion move, so we need to look at it and we need to understand why he played it. It's not the stockfish top move either. Stockfish moves the evaluation, I think, down to roughly equal after this move. But Magnus was confident. He said after the game he could win this position, and he knew he could win this position. So it's about finding, you know, ideas that you're happy with and confident with. So knight takes d4, and now he moved the rook to e1. Knight to c6, knight to c4. Some maneuvering. He's already looking at this pawn that we talked about targeting earlier on. Knight d5. Now let's see if we can find a clever way to keep hold of the bishop pair. This is a really cool move, in my opinion. Clever way of keeping hold of the bishop pair. And yes, you might lose the bishop pair, but you'll get a pawn and a winning position as compensation. So either keeping the bishop pair or getting a pawn and a winning position. Yeah, thank you, Bodhana. Rook b1. Very clever. Yeah, thanks, Rohit. That's fantastic. And Aidan. If the knight takes the bishop, we take back, and black can't defend this pawn. If he went a rook to b8, it doesn't help because it's attacked twice and only defended once. And once we take that pawn, it's going to be fairly straightforward for a world champion to win the game. And hopefully fairly straightforward for all you guys, because the position is falling apart. So Good. Gregory said it's easy. I think we should never say a position is easy because things can go wrong, especially when you're playing resilient opponents. But as long as you're confident you can win, you take your time and you don't relax too much, then I'm sure you could win that position. Because the b6 pawn falls. Okay, so Black would be stupid to take the bishop now, and he just moved the king into the game. And now the bishop went back to e1. So what is Magnus Carlsen doing? He's moving his bishops backwards, but he's preserving the bishop pair. And the bishop pair is very, very good in open positions. And this position is open. Well, it will be open when you see what White's up to next. So bishop e7, king e7. And this is by far probably the best move of the game. And it's absolutely fantastic, this move. And to even consider it and calculate it is a real move of a genius. So White to play. I mean, you may have already seen the move before, but who can play like Magnus Carlsen with his ingenious move here? Some suggestions of knight d6. Don't think the world champion will play that. Doesn't that just lose a piece, surely? Got knight d6. Can't I just take it in two ways? I don't even see a reason why any of them fail. You guys are going crazy. Magnus Carlsen's not the world champion because he just throws pieces. Knight takes pawn. Can't I just take that? Yeah, I can just take that. That's excellent. Anna's come up with the right move. Just go through the other moves. People have suggested king e3. That's an illegal move. I don't think the world champion would play illegal moves. Don't worry, I'm not going to say who suggested that move. So what else? We've got rook d1. That makes sense. Improving the rook. It's not the move of Magnus, but I think that's a good move. I don't see a problem with that. I'd be a bit nervous playing it because it is hanging, so it's not defended. We've just got to be careful there's no discoveries, but I don't think there are in that position. But the right move, Bodhana said it, and Anna was the first, but she didn't just tell me the move, Anna told me the follow-up. So it's king g1, and it looks very, very silly. In the end game, aren't we always told our king needs to come out into the action? Well, what's good about king g1 is even though we're going backwards, we're freeing up a route for our bishop into the game. When that bishop gets to g3, it's going to be in an amazing position. It's on a strong diagonal, and it's a long-term threat against these pawns, which we've already mentioned are bad. So once the bishop gets to g3, I know at the moment the knight on d5 is defending c7, but that knight's tied down to defending for a long, long time. On g3, that bishop becomes an amazing piece. And could we have moved the king somewhere else? Well, we've already discussed that e3 is illegal, and e2, well, that just runs into knight d4. And, well, where are we going to go? Well, we've probably got to go back to f2, because if we go this way, then there's lots going on. I'm not sure what the best move is, but bishop g6 looks a bit scary, and then the knights will come into the game. Remember, there's an X-ray attack on the king, and I'd be pretty scared I was losing there, if I'm honest. Yeah, knight b6 looks good as well. And Bodhana, yeah, that just looks horrible. So I would never move my king into the fire, especially when there's knights around and the rook's covering the d file. So at the moment we have to be patient and move the king backwards. Yeah, I mean, never move the king into the fire when there's all these knights around the board. You should always be scared of these knights, because there's forks that are going to pop out of nowhere, and then soon you might end up losing a piece or a pawn and probably the game. So king g1, and I think that's a genius move. Given it 2 exclamation marks in the study, because it's not a move that you would necessarily think of. Deactivating the king. Wow, it's not often we see that in the end game. We're always told we need to move the king and activate the king in the end game. Just looking at the chat, how many moves in this game? Who is the world's best player? Well, you'll see how many moves in the game. I'll go to that in a minute. Who's the world's best player? Well, I think it's Magnus Carlsen, but he'll have to prove that in a few weeks. And I hope all the Academy members are going to tune in to watch the World Championship match against Jan Nepo. I'm not even going to try and pronounce his surname. I'll just call it Nepo. Okay, right, knight b8. Now, White played bishop f2. Yeah, I mean, g3 is also interesting, but f2 makes sense as well, putting pressure on the pawn. So now there's a real threat. That pawn is now attacked twice and only defended once. Knight d7. Rook e1 check. If you can improve a piece with tempo, it's always going to be a good move. This knight is very well placed on c4, so it stops the king from activating itself on d6. And if the king went to d6, it might be able to defend the pawn, and then maybe we wouldn't be able to win that pawn. So I think that's a very good move. Rook e1, king went back, and now the rook went to d1. And this is a very, if you've not seen this idea before, you might say, well, the rook could just go to d1 in one move. But what we've done is we've forced the black king backwards, and then we've moved our rook to d1. So that's a very clever way of playing chess. Check. King has to go here, and then we go to d1. Now we've got an improved version of initially just playing rook d1. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm just looking at the chat. Got some Magnus fans and some Nepo fans. I'm most certainly a Magnus fan. I think he will win, but I think it'll be a close match. It'll be a very close match because Jan's not scared of him. Okay, king e7. Rook e1, king f8, and you might say, well, why is he just repeated? Just gaining some time, and now he went knight to d6, and that knight is now improved. Knight e5, and now decided to take the bishop on f7. King takes, and now black's knights do look quite impressive in the center. And if I was playing white, I'd be a little bit nervous because you've always got to look out for knight forks. So you've got to be very careful in these types of positions. White to play. Okay, what would you play now for white? Some suggestions, please. I think there's more than one good move here. Oh, we're still talking about the World Championship match. I think it's a really good idea if you can follow the match. You can learn a lot from following the games and playing through them. Maybe what I like to do is I like to play guess the move. So, just think about what I'd play and then see if that's what they play. It's a good way to learn. Okay, so we've had rook d1 as a suggestion. Good, I like that move. Bishop b5 is another suggestion. It activates the bishop. Yeah, I like that as well. Okay, yeah, good. Okay, so rook d1 was played in the game, and king e7, f4. That's a nice move because if black takes that pawn, then we've got a nice sequence of moves here. Do you want to tell me what it is in the chat? Make sure everyone's concentrating. What should white play now? I won't give you long for this because we are going to finish the session at 7 o'clock. Excellent, thanks, Gregory. So we take the rook, and then we get 2 pawns back. We just sacrifice 1 pawn, we get 2 pawns back, and we get connected pass pawns. And that should be an easy win. So black's not going to take that pawn. He's going to have to move the knight. And now rook e1 was played, king f8. A bit of maneuvering going on here. And now the bishop went to d4. The bishops are just moving around the board, trying to find the best squares. Adams is, putting up a really good defense, trying not to lose that b6 pawn. Let's just carry on with a few moves. Just a little bit of maneuvering here. There's lots of ways to play it, but I'm sure Magnus's way is very, very strong. Knight had to go back to h6, and now white made what I believe is a very good move here. So we've just pushed the knight back to the side of the board. What's a good move for white now? Maneuvering, what does it mean? A question in the chat. Maneuvering, it just means moving pieces around. Getting them to better squares, says Gregory. Good. I mean, maneuvering, we hope you'd get them to better squares. That knight, the black knight I'm holding on, has definitely not gone to a better square. That's on the side of the board, but it's been forced there. So let's try and fix it there for a bit. And we did that by moving the pawn to f5. Okay, the knight can get back into the game and get a life for itself by going to f7, but he's moving around, and now these bishops, they become even stronger. So that was a good move, and that was played. And then Magnus did defend with knight to f7. But look at these bishops now. They're not stuck behind pawns. They're on two very strong diagonals. And I think this is going to be very, very difficult for Mickey now. Things have gone wrong. Magnus is getting exactly what he wanted. And it's taken time, but he's patient. He takes his time. And I hope you guys are able to do that as well. Now, in this position, he decided to swap the rooks off. Take the pawn. And what's he doing now? Can black take on b2? He did. He certainly did. Now, what he's trying to do is he's trying to restrict these knights. And at one point, they were really well placed in the center. Now they're a little bit suspect on the sides of the board. Not quite the edge of the board, but close to the edge. Now, white just wants to, get a passed pawn and get it through. If he can get that a pawn to the other side, it's going to be game over. So bishop b6 check, and he decided to move the king first, because if we take this pawn now, does somebody want to tell me what you think black might play? It's still winning for white, but maybe Magnus was a little bit scared and just wanted to win by taking its time and making sure black didn't get any chances, because if you give your opponent counterplay, things can go wrong. Yeah, lots of people saying knight h3, and that is maybe what he was scared of. I don't know exactly, but it looks like it, because we've got to move the king, and then we've given a pawn back. I mean, white's position is a lot stronger, but I suppose black has scope to maybe get a passed pawn if white doesn't play accurately. So he decided to defend the h pawn, because black can't defend the a pawn, so there's no rush to take that pawn. And now he's a pawn up. He's got a passed pawn. If he plays sensibly and avoids any knight forks, he's going to win the game. Black's got a more active king, so we need to just be careful. And look at the power of these bishops. I mean, I like to call this a really instructive game for how Magnus plays with the bishop pair. And they looked really bad when they were on the back rank, when he went bishop f1 and bishop e1. But look at how they've come into the game. So at this point, he decides to give up the bishop pair, because he knows he can win the endgame, because he knows his endgames well. He knows this is technically winning, and he decides to change his advantage to an endgame advantage by giving up the bishop pair. And he's confident. He knows he can win this, so he goes ahead. He does bishop d2 just to restrict the king, and then after knight a6, he makes the move a5, and black will never be able to capture that pawn, because even if the knight and king are attacking it and it's only defended by the bishop, by then white will have had time to get the king round and win on the king's side. So it's nice when you can move a pawn and you know your opponent will never be able to take it. So this is just what happens. Brings his king round. Black didn't have time to attack it a second time, because then white's king will hop around over here and it will be game over. So black tries to hold on, but to hold on in these positions is very, very hard / impossible. Factor in the fact you're playing the world champion, it's more than impossible. So got to try, but now white's pawns are racing up the board. And at some point, Mickey's going to resign. And at this point, he realized he had absolutely no chances and he resigned. To me, that's a really instructive game because Magnus shows the power of changing his advantages. So he won a pawn. Well, he won a pawn by Mickey's sacrifice. And then after he decided to give that pawn back because he thought he could win the end game with the two bishops. And then at the point where he realized he knew how to win the bishop versus knight very confidently, he gave up the bishop pair and then he went into the nice end game. My two favorite moves of that game, which I'll just bring back up, are knight to d2. And he didn't just play that by accident, he had it all planned out. So knight to d2 here, with the idea of going to a1. I mean, it's not very often you think about putting your knight on a1. And then the other one is king g1. I mean, those moves look very silly in the sense that we're told not to put knights in the corner of the board and we're told not to move the king backwards in the end game. But there are exceptions to every rule, and Magnus really demonstrates those really clearly in this game. So I think that's a very, very good game. It's a shame that he beat Mickey Adams, but Mickey Adams has beaten Magnus before. I remember it wasn't my first Olympiad, but one of the Olympiads, Mickey Adams beat Magnus Carlsen. So, you know, he's beaten him before. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that game and I hope you can learn things from that game. And like I say, play through it more than once because there's so much substance to that game. And you might not pick everything up instantly, but keep having a look through it and try to think, why has he played that? Why has he played that move? And you can learn a lot. So I hope you enjoyed that game. Thanks for tuning in. I'm just going to stop the recording.